All right. So we have been talking about what determines the diversity of local communities. And we have gotten through some of the hypotheses that people have considered. And there's two sets of general kinds of hypotheses: equilibrium hypotheses that rely on biotic interactions, and non-equilibrium hypotheses that are more reliant on conditions of the physical environment. And what we saw last time was that communities that have more species at the local level tend to have one of two things. They either tend to have more niche space, which was exemplified by the morphological diversity of those bats that we saw. Bat wings tell you how bats make their living. Short, fat wings are insectivores. They're turning sharply, whereas big, long wings are frugivores that are flying long distances to find fruit. You find a greater diversity of morphology in Africa than you do in Canada. And that's because in Canada there's nothing for bats to eat except bugs. Okay, so greater resource diversity, greater niche space is one important explanation for why local communities might differ in the number of species that they have. The second one is specialization. Communities that have more species also tend to have more specialized species. Now, this could be either because of ecological segregation due to just competitive interactions, or it could actually be due to character displacement. Okay. Remember, just because you see the pattern doesn't mean that you know the mechanism that produced it. So be a little cautious when you see that. Okay, what we don't see is niche overlap being a prominent explanation for why some communities have more species than others. You can't pack too many species together if their niches overlap. That's just unstable. And we know it's unstable from the discussion we had about character displacement. We know that if you're suffering from both inter- and intraspecific competition, your fitness goes down. And the fitness of individuals that experience only intraspecific competition will be much higher. And so characters will diverge. You will not have high levels of overlap. And this is not an explanation that is supported in general in nature. So two of the three make some sense. The third one does not. Let's turn our attention to the non-equilibrium hypotheses that are related to the abiotic environment. Okay, so some of these have surprising patterns. And I'd like you to get out your clickers and we'll just poll you on what you think. And then we'll tell you what it actually is. So, the first of those hypotheses has to do with resource availability. Now, what we need to do is to think about this in a particular way. It's not the diversity of resources available, it's the amount of crucial resources available. So for plants, this is particularly easy to understand. Plants need soil nutrients, right? Well, how does the absolute amount of nitrogen available in the soil affect species diversity? So would low levels of nitrogen versus high levels of nitrogen, that is, the availability of a particular resource, how would that affect diversity? Would high resource availability, say lots of nitrogen, provide more ways to divide up the environment and thus support more species, have higher species diversity, allow our selected species to outcompete everybody else, or some combination? So let's just see what you think. Because the answer is at least potentially surprising to some people. Come on, stop that. Okay, we're not open yet. All right, now let's see. Could we be open? Somebody try to click in? Nah, okay. Let's get rid of this. Let's try it again. All right, now we're open. All right.
What would be the difference between having higher species diversity and having higher diversity?
Higher species diversity. Well, that's just, I left out a word. That's all. Okay, so this is resource availability. This is the amount of a resource. And this is,
So B and E are the same.
what, B and E are the same? Oh, have high? No, yeah, so they are. Well, thank you for pointing that out. I didn't see that. So it's just A through D. Forget E. So. Okay. All right. I think we're done. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We're done. So let's get this on the screen. See what y'all think. Come on. Okay. So most of you are going for both more ways to divide up the environment and higher species diversity. Let's see. One of you is picking one of those two. 3 of you are picking the other of those two. 3 people picked our selected species outcompete everybody else. You 3 are right. Everybody else is wrong. Higher resource availability is counterintuitively not related to species diversity, and we'll now go through why that is. Higher availability of resources simply allows the R-selected weeds to drive everybody else extinct. And we've seen this experimentally over and over and over again. This is perhaps the most impressive demonstration of this. Let's do this here. Okay, so this is a long-term experiment, and when I mean long, when I say long-term here, I mean generationally long. We started this experiment in 1856, and it's still going on today. So you figure it out. It's like over 150 years. Almost 170 years, actually, that this experiment has been going on. So these crazy people in England, where there is not much to do, there's not much biological diversity, so people focus on strange things. They observe birds a lot in England, they catch insects a lot there, so they're obsessed with certain things. And of course, they have these experiments, and they sort of pass them on from father to son scientifically, or mother to daughter, as the case may be, depending on what gender the scientist is. But they have been fertilizing these plots in this little experimental farm for 170 years now. And this is what's happened to the species, what you call it, curve. Yeah, whatever it is. Species abundance curve, there you go. So we started out with about 30 species, and here's the dominance relationship. So, you know, it's kind of steep, and you have a few species that kind of dominate, but there's plenty of other species in there that are less common. If you go back and census those plots over time, you see what's happening is that you're progressively losing species, and 1 or 2 is becoming progressively more dominant. And now you have, as far as 1950 goes, you had only 3 species, one of which accounted for almost every individual in these plots. Increasing the amount of nitrogen available in these plots basically killed species diversity. It simply allowed the R-selected species to go crazy. Why is that? Because it eliminated competition. It eliminated competition for a limiting resource. So there's reasonable amounts of light, that wasn't a limiting resource, but soil nitrogen was a limiting resource. And our selected species are the ones that prosper when there's no competition, because they reproduce like crazy. So that's all that's left. Now, this is a very, very general pattern, and we were very surprised to find this pattern when we first saw it. But it holds up over and over and over again for species, for community after community. So here are just a few examples of some communities. And what you see is a really interesting relationship here. In some cases, diversity peaks at intermediate levels of resource availability and then falls off. So it kind of depends on where you start. That field in England that was fertilized for 170 years started off somewhere here on the downslope already. So it had a fair amount of resource availability already, and we just added to it. And so all we did then was kill off the good competitors and favor the weeds. But you see it over and over again. So here are, let's see, Malaysian rainforests. So here's species richness, and this is 300 species of trees, and here's soil nutrients. So the higher the soil nutrients, the fewer the species. Here's the biomass in that same thing, which is really interesting. The biomass actually peaks at intermediate levels of resource availability. Our focus today is actually on species. So, but this is two kinds of seashore habitats, and these are desert rodents. Oh my gosh! So this is rainfall in deserts. Okay, and rainfall is what limits productivity in deserts. The more rainfall in the desert, the more seeds that plants produce, and the more food there is for rodents. Well, the more food there is for rodents, the less competition there is. The ones that reproduce best are the ones that win. And they win very quickly. So they drive out all the others. So, this humped relationship, though, tells us that at low resource availability, we're favoring only the best competitors because we have a limiting resource. So whoever's good at competing for that resource persists in the community. The weeds need lots and lots of that resource. So there are no weeds here. There are only good competitors. At intermediate levels of resource availability, you can support both kinds of species. But at high levels of resource availability, there's no need to compete. So you just pour all your energy into reproduction if you can, and everybody else goes extinct. So only the weeds, only the R-selected species persist at really high levels of resource availability. That's pretty remarkable. It was very counterintuitive. We did not expect this relationship, but there it is. And it actually makes logical sense based on R and K selection. So here's a kind of a extreme example of diversity declining with productivity in other communities. This is a West African set of plots, and soil fertility really favors the weeds. If soils are infertile in this area of Africa, then they have lots and lots of, and look, it's not just a few species, it's a lot. This is almost 200 species of plants. So even modest increases in resource availability in terms of nitrogen or phosphorus in the soil allow the weeds to outcompete everybody else. So there's a counterintuitive result, and it's a really important one. And it has real applications for human society because, of course, what do we do when we want a particular species not to be limited by some limiting resource, like, say, We're growing corn, and we want a higher yield. What do? We fertilize the soil. What happens to the fertilizer that is not absorbed by the corn? Runs off into the rivers of the Midwest, where it kills most of the fish, leaving only the weedy fish, like carp. It flows all the way down the Mississippi River and gets dumped into the Gulf and results in very high productivity and dead zones where species diversity crashes. So resource availability has not just theoretical influences on species diversity, it has practical influences on human society as well. Okay, how about that second non-equilibrium hypothesis about complexity? Environmental complexity. Get out your clickers and let's take a poll here. All right, so here we have, if you have higher environmental complexity, or as we say, heterogeneity, what would that do? Would that provide more ways to divide up the environment? Would it have higher species diversity? See, I left off the last one. I remember to remove that last thing. Would it allow our selected species to outcompete everything else, or would it be a combination of A and B? Now that you're kind of clued in that things may be more complicated than they seem. Oh, come on. What's going on here? It's just not cooperating. Okay, we should be open. Yes, okay, we're open. So let's see what you think. And then we'll reveal the truth.
I have trust issues.
What's that?
I have trust issues. I don't know.
You have trust issues. Well, but you're not being graded on this one. You get a point for responding. So just take your best guess. Okay, and I think we're done. Let's have a look. Okay, yeah, trust issues. So some of you are saying it's more ways to divide up, more diversity, weedy species win, and then both A and B. Well, this time, both A and B. Trust issues, yeah. It's when you get primed for counterintuitive things, you sometimes jump at counterintuitive things when they're not actually right. So this one actually is more like sensible. So greater environmental heterogeneity does in fact provide more ways to divide up the environment, and it does in fact promote species diversity in local communities. And so here's an excellent example from very simple communities of birds. And so here is a measure of complexity, which is the volume of foliage above 6 meters. So like this is the degree to which we're talking about a woody plant community with trees rather than shrubs or grasses. Okay, and the interesting thing is that there can be more shrub and herb and grass species in a community than tree species, but the complexity of the environment in terms of just the spatial complexity of branches and leaves that are available is strongly related to the number of birds you get. If you have basically a grassland community, you only get a couple of species. If you have a lot of trees with a lot of complex foliage up top, then you provide way more opportunities for other species of birds to persist. So that makes a lot of sense. A complex environment means you're not always going to compete strongly with another species that's similar to you. So yes, both More ways to divide up the environment. That means more niches and, as a result, higher species diversity. Here's a slightly different study that supports this again in birds. And here's foliage height diversity. This is, like I said, a different study, but it has the same result. Here's the bird diversity, and this is Shannon diversity. So look, we're talking about very few species here, and we're talking about lots of species here. This is not just one species and three species. This is like one species and maybe 70 or 80 very evenly distributed species. So it's a huge effect. The more complex the environment, the more opportunities there are for birds to find a way to make a living in a unique way and have a unique niche which they don't share with anybody else. Now, this provides an explanation for something that really baffled us for decades, and that's plankton. Think about plankton. Where are they found? They're found in the surface waters of the ocean and in lakes and such. And that's a pretty homogeneous environment. And yet there are hundreds of species of plankton. How is it possible for there to be hundreds of species of plankton in a uniform environment where there's apparently no complexity whatsoever? We're just not looking at the right things. We're not looking hard enough. We were looking at, say, just water and not seeing what the plankton were seeing. Here is a lake in Nevada, Pyramid Lake, and it has a bunch of algae, a bunch of plankton, and way more than we would expect. And the lake looks like a lake. It doesn't look to us as humans as if there's any heterogeneity in there at all. But if we go down there with a little sampling vial and we sample the water and we ask, what nutrients are in that water? We see this amazingly complex mosaic of nutrient availability in the surface waters. And it's different for different nutrients. So here you have a relatively, it says greater than 10, this is relatively high nitrate concentration. Here's a real hot spot of nitrate. And here is really lower nitrate. And here's really nitrate poor areas. There's way more heterogeneity in this lake than we ever expected. And if you overlay the heterogeneity in this nutrient with the heterogeneity in this nutrient, you don't get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 areas, distinctive areas. You get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. You get a dozen areas with only 2 of these nutrients. The other nutrients in the lake have similarly uncorrelated variation in availability. So with just 2 of these nutrients, you get 12 distinctive areas. With 3 of these nutrients, you get 40. Is it now hard to see how there might be a lot of different plankton species in this lake? They're seeing something completely different than we are. The hidden heterogeneity in nature is a really compelling explanation for species diversity in local communities. Okay. And we find that heterogeneity applies to many, many, many communities. So here is vegetation, height, diversity, and bird species. Again, this is yet a third study. This is California and Chile, the Mediterranean climates of California and Chile. This is fish, and this is vegetation diversity in a stream. The more diverse the vegetation on the stream bottom, the more diverse the fish community that lives on it. Here's the number of substrate types in a stream, and here's the number of snail species that can live there. This is basically one type of substrate, maybe silt. And here, there are patches of silt, patches of sand, patches of big rocks, there are boulders. Species diversity is clearly related to heterogeneity. Okay. And here are lizard species. Okay, and here's some measures of things that we think could potentially be related, but plant species diversity is only loosely related to lizard species diversity. Total plant coverage in a desert, that's important because it provides sun and shade, right? Helps the lizards find ways to thermoregulate. That's very loosely related. But look, structural diversity of the plants. Not just the number of species, but whether you've got a mix of grasses, herbs, and shrubs. You have a mixture of grasses, herbs, and shrubs here, and you have only open sand here. Environmental complexity is very important. Okay, last of the three. And let me just make it clear, there are probably a dozen others, but we've mostly discarded them as important explanations, not because they don't explain a particular case, but because they don't seem to explain many cases, as these three do. The last one is disturbance. So get out your clickers and tell me about this one now. If you have high levels of disturbance, are you gonna work for me or not? There, okay. Should be open. Yeah, we're open. If you have high levels of disturbance, what do you think? Would high levels of disturbance provide more ways to divide up the environment? Would they have higher species diversity? Would they allow our selected species to outcompete everybody? Would it be some combination of the first two? And Ahmad has not got over his trust issues. I can see it in his eyes. Nor have some of the rest of you. Yeah, just answer. It's really okay. All right, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and we are done. Let's see what we think. Yeah, this is okay. This really illustrates trust issues here. Okay. You can be forgiven for this because this was also not obvious to people. One thing about these abiotic mechanisms is that they continually surprise us. And they surprise, all three of these surprised us greatly when we really worked out what was going on. But as it turns out, all three of them apply to a lot of communities, and they provide powerful explanations for patterns of difference in local diversity. So, let's talk about this. As it turns out, intermediate disturbance provides the highest diversity among communities. And in fact, high disturbance rates do provide the opportunity for our selected species, that is weeds, to just drive everybody else out. Why is that? How long do weeds live? Early successional species, what's their lifespan? Short. Okay, so if you have regular disturbance, you think about killing organisms regularly, are the short-lived ones going to prosper, or are the long-lived ones going to prosper where you have lots of disturbance? The long-lived ones will not reach reproductive maturity. They'll die before they can reproduce. So only the weeds are present where there's high levels of disturbance. So this is the original figure.
What was the answer to the figure?
It's C. Our selected species drive everybody else out. Those are the weeds. So here's frequent disturbance and infrequent disturbance. Here's the recurrence interval soon after a disturbance or long time. And here are large disturbances versus small disturbances. So basically, disturbance is frequent, it's severe, and it's large. Well, the only thing that's going to live here is short-lived species. Those are the R-selected weeds. Here, you don't have frequent disturbances. There is a long interval between them, and when they do happen, they tend to be small. That gives the good competitors time to grow, mature, reproduce, and drive out the weeds. Intermediate levels of disturbance actually provide opportunities for all of them to coexist. So diversity is greatest at intermediate disturbance levels. And this figure was done for coral reefs and for tropical rainforest in the original publication in Science from which this was copied. And it's Robert Payne, the guy who did the intertidal work on food webs, again. And some people just do stuff. Okay, well, this was the theoretical paper that kicked off the research program. What research have we found? Well, I'm going to just present you a very, very simple one, but here's intertidal communities on rocky shores, which are really easy to work with. They're very easy to manipulate, right? And they get lots of disturbance. If you think about a rocky shore exposed to the Pacific Ocean, there's all kinds of stuff crashing onto that shore and crushing everything on the rocks continually. High disturbance. If you think about, say, going around the lee side of that very same rocky shore into a sheltered bay where the waves are not continually bashing the rocks with things like floating logs or cars from Fukushima, then there's much lower disturbance. Okay, so what do we see? So here's exposed shores, and here's the dominance of two species here. And notice where there's high disturbance here, you get only one of the two species. Where you have less disturbance on these exposed shores, then you get coexistence of two species. Okay, this is not a huge diversity difference, but it illustrates the point. On the protected areas, here you lose this species because this one's a better competitor. This is the species that is the good competitor. And look, it can only persist where there's not a lot of disturbance in the high disturbance zone. Where there's a low disturbance zone, particularly where there's the lowest disturbance, it just wipes out the other species, the poorer competitor. This is the faster growing one, and this is the only one that you find where disturbance is high. You don't find the good competitor because it grows slowly and gets killed before it can reproduce. Over here, however, it progressively gets wiped out by the better competitor. They coexist where there's intermediate levels of disturbance primarily. The good competitor wins when there's low disturbance. The species that reproduces fast wins where there's high disturbance. And they coexist only when there's middle levels of disturbance. Okay, this is not the most exciting example, but it's a very simple example to understand. Just two species, one's a fast reproducer, one's a good competitor. They both coexist where there's intermediate levels of disturbance. The one that reproduces well is the only one that can tolerate high levels of disturbance. The good competitor kills them all off where there's no disturbance. So that's why I'm showing you this one. Okay. Questions about the abiotic hypotheses? Yes, Kiefer.
Don't mussels and algae reproduce quickly?
Well, you got to think about it. These guys are competing for space on the rocks. If algae overgrows the rocks, the mussels can't persist. Okay? Because they can't anchor themselves. So they are competing for space. Now, the specific kinds of algae that we're talking about are, this is maybe not the ideal experiment to illustrate everything that you might want illustrated when we're talking about disturbance. But basically, the algae is able to hang on and grow slowly and just overgrow the rocks. But it does so rather slowly. The only way that it can persist is if it has the time to overgrow the rocks and isn't completely wiped off the rocks by disturbance continually. If it gets that chance, then there's no way for the mussels to anchor themselves. And mussels are constantly putting out little sprats, is what we call them, little propagules, that are continually looking for opportunities to anchor, and a mussel will put out hundreds of thousands. So if you think about it in those terms, even though mussels might seem to be bigger, they're actually kind of more R-selected. They produce a lot of propagules, and that's what we think of as an R-selected strategy. So I was hoping you wouldn't bring that up because it takes, a couple of minutes to explain that. But anyway. Other questions? So, intermediate levels of disturbance, high diversity. The higher the complexity of the environment, the higher the diversity. And relatively low to intermediate levels of resource availability yield the highest diversity. Okay, well, we're going to leave this local regulation now, and we're going to start talking about kind of a different way to think about local communities. And that is just colonization and extinction. Okay, so given that you might have, say, a particular set of conditions, like consistent levels of disturbance from one patch to another, kind of similar levels of resource availability from one patch to another, kind of similar, whatever, similar structural heterogeneity. There's still lots of differences in species diversity in these local patches. Well, that has to do primarily with the ability of species to find those patches and to persist in those patches. So that is the realm of island biogeography. And this is kind of a local and non-equilibrium set of ideas, but we think of it somewhat differently than these other hypotheses. This is not strictly abiotic regulation because it involves species trying to move across a landscape. Okay, and we will take this in 2 lectures. Today we'll finish up by introducing the ideas of island biogeography. And next time, we'll talk about how we apply island biogeography very generally to habitat patches everywhere. So first, we'll just look at the patterns of diversity on islands and in patches that inspired this theory. We'll look at the trade-off between colonization and extinction and how that produces an equilibrium in number of species in a patch. We'll talk about what it means for an island to be near or far from a source of species, or for an island to be large or small as a target. And then we'll talk about conservation biology. We won't get that far today, but we'll come back to it next time. And then we'll talk about more generally how we apply this idea to landscapes. So first off, the thing to understand here is that any patch that is isolated from similar patches by unfavorable habitat can be considered to be an island. Okay, the classic islands that we think of are, in fact, the inspiration for this idea, this body of theory. The Galapagos Islands are land in the middle of water. The Canary Islands, land in the middle of water. Terrestrial species don't do well in open ocean, right? And yet, terrestrial species get onto those islands. And there are different numbers of species on different islands. So the general pattern that we expect is that habitat islands should be easy to colonize if they are close, and hard to find if they are far away. So close islands, on average, should have more species than far islands. Should have more species on the Channel Islands in California than in the Hawaiian Islands, on average. Because the Hawaiian Islands are 2,500 miles away from the coast of California. Channel Islands are about 30. Now, the size of populations on the island depends on the area. The larger the area, the bigger the population you can support. And what do we know about small populations? They go extinct at a high rate. So larger islands should be able to maintain higher populations, and they should have lower extinction rates. So larger islands should have more species than small islands. Excuse me. So let's see some evidence. How does this actually work in nature? Well, okay, so here's islands near New Guinea, and here's bird species, and here's the area. So larger islands should have more species. These lines should go up, and they do. But look, here's an island that's far away from New Guinea, and it has this area, and here's an island that's much nearer to New Guinea, and it has the same area. And this has lots more species. This has like 80 species. This has like, this would be about 30, because it's a log scale. Okay, here are intermediate islands, and look, this island is about the same size as this one. This one has 10 species. This one, again, has roughly 30 because it's closer. It's easier to colonize. So island size makes a difference. Larger islands have more species. Island distance makes a difference. Close islands have more species than far islands. So this clearly is a reflection of the ability of animals and plants to colonize these islands. If you think about organisms that find it hard to move across the open ocean, that pattern of near versus far should be really exaggerated. There should be a big difference between near and far islands. On the other hand, if you look at species that find it easy to cross large distances, there should be much less of a difference. And that's in fact what we find. This is bird species. and they find it easy to get to the Channel Islands. These are much larger, but they're much further, so you get not very many species. As it turns out, it is so hard for ferns, which rely on actually what? Spores blowing in the wind. It's so hard for ferns to colonize these islands that not a hell of a lot of difference there. So birds fly, ferns don't. Birds find it easier to disperse than ferns. Let's look then at extinction risk. So you may remember this figure from talking about metapopulations. So here's the population size, here's the risk of extinction, and clearly large islands should have a low risk of extinction. So if a species gets to a large island, it should be able to survive. If a species gets to a small island, it may be there for a while, but it has a high risk of extinction, so it may turn over quickly. So I will end today by showing you the basic graph of island biogeography, which is that there's some rate of colonization, the arrival of new species, and there's some rate of extinction here. And where those lines cross, that is the number of species you would predict would typically be found on that island. So this is a rate of extinction, this is a rate of colonization. Here, the rate at which species arrive exactly equals the rate at which they go extinct. Now, this set of curves requires a little bit more explanation. And we will start next time by putting this up and showing you the explanations. Because it's not as simple as it looks. And you need to understand exactly what it's saying. But we are done for today. You do